Imagine you work at one of the most powerful technology companies on earth. You have spent years of your career building software that hundreds of millions of people use every single day. You are good at your job. You care about the product. You care about the people using it. And then one morning, you sit down at your desk and you are asked to ship a feature that you believe is wrong, not technically broken, not impossible to implement, just wrong. Wrong for the users. Wrong for the relationship between the product and the people who depend on it. Wrong in a way that you can see clearly from where you sit inside the organization, and that the people making the decision appear either not to see or not to care about. What do? You have a mortgage. You have a team that depends on you. You have a career built on the credibility of the company whose name is on your badge. So you do what most people in that situation do. You raise it internally. You make the case in meetings. You write the memo. You try to change the outcome through the legitimate channels available to you. And when none of that works, when the decision gets made anyway, and the feature ships and the users react exactly the way you predicted they would, you are left with a set of options that range from acceptance to escalation. And in March 2026, one of the most senior engineers at Microsoft chose escalation. Not through a leak to a journalist, not through an anonymous forum post. On his own name, on his own social media account, in a public response that the entire technology press saw within hours, and that told the world something about the state of Windows 11 that Microsoft's official communications had been carefully avoiding saying. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly what was said, by whom, what it reveals about the internal dynamics at Microsoft that produced the mandatory account requirement in the first place. Why engineers inside a company of Microsoft's size and culture making public statements like this one is more unusual and more significant than it might initially appear. What the broader pattern of internal dissent at Microsoft over Windows 11's direction tells you about how the product got to where it is, and what the relationship between that internal dissent and the reversals Microsoft has been quietly making throughout 2026 tells you about whether the company is genuinely changing direction or performing the appearance of change for an audience it is afraid of losing. Start with the moment itself, because the specific words matter and the context in which they were said matters even more. In March 2026, Scott Hanselman, a partner product manager and vice president of developer community at Microsoft, a person with enough seniority and enough institutional standing that his public statements carry weight beyond those of a junior engineer venting on social media, responded to a user on X who was expressing frustration about Windows 11's mandatory Microsoft account requirement during setup. The user was not asking a technical question. They were expressing a sentiment that millions of Windows users had been expressing for years through every channel available to them, that the requirement to create or sign into a Microsoft account before being allowed to use a computer you had purchased was unreasonable, was invasive, and was a fundamentally disrespectful imposition on the relationship between a user and their own hardware. Scott Hanselman's response to a comment asking about removing the login requirement on Windows 11 read, "Yeah, I hate that. Working on it." 4 words that became a headline across every major technology publication within hours of being posted. Not because the sentiment was surprising to anyone who had spent time thinking about Windows 11's direction. The sentiment was not surprising at all. The surprise was the source. This was not a disgruntled former employee speaking anonymously to a journalist. This was not a Reddit post from someone claiming to know someone who works at Microsoft. This was a named senior currently employed Microsoft executive saying publicly, without apparent institutional authorization, that he personally found one of his own company's most deliberate and consequential product decisions objectionable, and that he was actively working to change it. Hanselman's comments make it clear that mandatory logins are controversial everywhere, even inside Microsoft. Even inside Microsoft. That phrase is doing the work of the entire story, not just controversial among users, not just controversial in the technology press, controversial inside the organization that made the decision. XDA developers, tech power up. To understand why internal dissent at a company like Microsoft is significant in a way that internal dissent at smaller companies might not be, you need to understand how Microsoft makes product decisions and what the organizational culture around those decisions looks like. Microsoft is not a startup where a small team of founders can debate a product direction over lunch and ship a different decision the next morning. It is a company of 220,000 employees, with multiple layers of management between the engineers who build features and the executives who set strategic direction, with product planning cycles that run 18 months to 2 years ahead of actual shipping, with legal and communications review processes for public statements, and with a culture that has historically valued institutional loyalty and message discipline as organizational virtues. When a senior Microsoft employee makes a public statement that is critical of a current product decision, they are not doing so casually. They are doing so with the understanding that their statement will be seen by their manager, by their manager's manager, by the communications team that would prefer such statements, go through approval processes, and by the press that will use it as evidence of internal disagreement. The decision to make that statement publicly, rather than keeping it in the internal forums where product debates normally happen at Microsoft, is itself a decision that communicates something. It communicates that the internal forums have not produced the change the person wants to see, that the decision has already been made through the normal channels and the result was not satisfactory, that taking the conversation public is the next escalation in a process that has already exhausted the quieter options. Some senior Microsoft engineers who have influence over leadership decisions are internally advocating for an MSA-free login experience. If the idea is given a green light sooner rather than later, it could mean you'll be able to set up a PC without signing into a Microsoft account. The plural matters. Senior engineers, not a senior engineer. Hanselman's tweet was the public face of a disagreement that was already happening across multiple people with influence inside Microsoft's Windows organization. The public statement was the visible tip of an internal argument that had been ongoing long enough and persistently enough that someone with Hanselman's seniority and institutional standing decided the argument needed external pressure to resolve. This is how change happens inside large organizations when internal advocacy fails. The person who wants change creates external visibility for the internal disagreement, which changes the cost calculation for the decision makers by adding reputational and public relations considerations to what was previously a purely internal product debate. Hanselman did not tweet because he wanted to vent his frustration publicly. He tweeted because he understood that public visibility of the disagreement would change the dynamics of the internal debate in ways that purely internal advocacy had not been able to achieve. The mandatory Microsoft account requirement did not arrive in Windows 11 by accident, and it did not arrive without people inside Microsoft raising concerns about it. Understanding how it got there, despite those concerns, tells you something important about the organizational forces that produced it and the organizational forces that are now producing the reversal. The requirement exists because of a strategic decision made at a level of the organization above the engineers who implement features. A decision that the user account associated with a Windows machine should be a Microsoft account rather than a local account, because Microsoft accounts create the persistent identity that connects users to Microsoft's ecosystem of services. OneDrive, Microsoft 365, the Microsoft Store, Bing, Xbox. The entire portfolio of recurring revenue services that Microsoft has been building for the past decade, and that depend on having a durable, cloud-linked user identity associated with every Windows device. The engineers who implement the setup experience did not decide this. The product managers who design the out-of-box experience screens did not decide this. This was a strategic decision made by people whose job is to grow Microsoft's services business, implemented as a constraint that the Windows setup team was required to build around. The dissent from engineers like Hanselman is dissent not against a decision their peers made, but against a constraint their organization imposed. A constraint they believe is damaging the product in ways that the services-focused decision makers either did not adequately weigh or weighed differently than the people who have to live with the consequences in user feedback, in press coverage, and in migration statistics. The specific shape of what the mandatory account requirement costs Microsoft is something that the people inside the organization have a much clearer view of than the public does, because they have access to the data that the public cannot see. They can see the dropout rate at the account setup step during Windows 11 installation, the percentage of users who abandon setup or find workarounds rather than completing the Microsoft account flow. They can see the correlation between the account requirements tightening across successive Windows 11 updates and the acceleration of certain user behavior metrics that Microsoft monitors carefully. They can see the support ticket volume generated by users who cannot complete setup without internet connectivity, because the account requirement makes offline setup nearly impossible. They can see the relationship between the account requirement and the search volume for terms like how to install Windows 11 without Microsoft account, which reached levels that any product team would recognize as a measure of user resistance at scale. The engineers who are dissenting internally are dissenting with data. They are not expressing a philosophical preference for local accounts over Microsoft accounts. They are making an argument that the mandatory account requirement is producing measurable, quantifiable costs in user experience and user trust that exceed the benefits it generates in account capture and services engagement. And they are losing that argument internally until public visibility of the disagreement changes the calculation. Microsoft's laundry list for Windows 11 actually looks pretty good. The blog post by Pavan Davuluri, Windows and Devices VP at Microsoft, candidly, if indirectly, recognizes what many of us have been feeling of late, namely that the quality of Windows 11 has been on the slide. Over the past several months, the team and I have spent a great deal of time analyzing your feedback. The blog post that accompanied the public acknowledgement of Windows 11's quality decline is itself a document worth examining carefully for what it reveals about the organizational dynamics at play. Davuluri is the VP of Windows and Devices. He's not a junior product manager finding his voice on social media. He is the person with organizational authority over the product, and his decision to publish a blog post that candidly acknowledges quality decline is a decision made at the level of the organization that has the power to implement the changes being discussed. The relationship between Hanselman's tweet and Davuluri's blog post is not coincidental. Hanselman's tweet created public visibility for an internal debate. Davuluri's blog post is the institutional response to that visibility, an acknowledgement that the debate is real, that the criticism it reflects is valid, and that the organization is committing to address it. The sequence: engineer tweets dissent, executive publishes acknowledgement, changes begin appearing in insider builds, is the organizational mechanism through which the mandatory account requirement is being removed. The internal advocates for change used public visibility to create institutional pressure that internal advocacy alone had not generated, and it worked. The broader pattern of internal dissent that Windows 11's troubled period has produced is visible not just in Hanselman's tweet, but in the accumulation of product decisions that have been reversed, walked back, or quietly modified since late 2025. Microsoft quietly began removing Copilot from Notepad, Photos, and other core apps in March 2026, a retreat that only confirmed what frustrated users already knew. Each of these retreats represents a decision that someone inside Microsoft argued against before it was made and that the organization made anyway, that then generated the external response that the internal advocate predicted, that then created the conditions for the reversal. The Copilot embedding in Notepad was opposed internally by people who argued that a text editor is a tool users want to be simple and fast, and that adding an AI sidebar to it serves Microsoft's Copilot adoption metrics more than it serves users who open Notepad to paste something quickly. The argument was made. The feature shipped anyway. The feedback arrived. The feature was removed. The mandatory account requirement followed the same arc over a longer timeline. The Bing integration in Windows Search followed the same arc. The aggressive update disruption that Davuluri's blog post commits to reducing followed the same arc. In each case, internal dissent that failed to prevent the decision was eventually vindicated by the external response to that decision, and the organization was forced to reverse course at greater cost to user trust than it would have paid if the internal dissent had been heeded in the first place. PC Gamer. This pattern tells you something important about the organizational structure that produced these decisions, and about whether the reversals currently underway represent a genuine structural change or a tactical response to immediate pressure. The decisions that are now being reversed were not made by people who did not have access to the counter-arguments. The engineers who knew the mandatory account requirement would generate the resistance it generated raised that concern. The product managers who knew the Copilot embedding in core apps would feel intrusive rather than helpful raised that concern. The organizational structure that overrode those concerns in favor of services growth metrics and AI adoption targets is still in place. Pavan Davuluri's blog post and Scott Hanselman's tweet are evidence that the people inside Microsoft who advocate for user experience over services capture are currently winning a particular battle. They are not evidence that the organizational structure that has been consistently choosing services capture over user experience has been dismantled or restructured. The question that the coming 18 months will answer is whether the people currently winning this battle have won it permanently, by changing the decision-making criteria at the organizational level that determines which considerations prevail when user experience and services growth conflict, or whether they have won it temporarily by demonstrating that certain decisions generate enough external resistance to create costs that exceed the benefits of the decisions themselves, while leaving the underlying organizational dynamics unchanged. What you should take from the story of Microsoft's internal dissent is not primarily the good news that the mandatory account requirement is being removed, real as that good news is. What you should take is the framework for evaluating every Windows decision that follows. When Microsoft ships a feature that feels like it serves the product rather than serving you, ask whether the engineers who built it were making a user experience decision or implementing a service's growth constraint. When Microsoft reverses a decision, ask whether the reversal reflects a genuine change in the criteria by which product decisions are made or a tactical response to a specific external pressure. When a senior Microsoft engineer says something publicly that their communications team would not have approved, pay attention to what they are saying and to the organizational dynamics that made them say it rather than keep it internal. The internal advocates who want Windows to be a tool that respects its users rather than a platform that monetizes them are real. They are numerous, they are senior enough to have influence, and they are currently in a period of unusual organizational ascendancy. Whether that ascendancy persists depends on whether the business case they are making, that user trust and user retention are more valuable in the long run than forced account capture and aggressive service integration, continues to be validated by the external data that Microsoft's leadership is watching, The mandatory account requirement is being removed because the internal advocates for removing it were right about what it was costing and wrong about how long it would take the organization to listen. The lesson is that they were always right. The only question was always how long it would take.